The afternoon sun, filtered through the Grand Meridian's stained glass dome, cast kaleidoscopic patterns across the polished marble floor. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet witnessed only by Maryanne Lawrence and the imposing figure of Elliot Winchester. Maryanne, fresh from a long afternoon volunteering at the city's soup kitchen, shifted her weight. The worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder, suddenly feeling heavier than it had moments ago. She'd anticipated the cool reprieve of the hotel's air conditioning, the hushed elegance a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Instead, a chill, sharper than any draft, settled over her. It emanated from the impeccably dressed man before her, his gaze lingering on her simple cotton dress and sensible flats with an undisguised disdain. A flicker of annoyance sparked within her. He's judging me. Based on what? A few wrinkles on my dress? I'm here to meet my husband, she stated, her voice calm despite the rising irritation. The faint scent of disinfectant still clung to her clothes, a testament to her afternoon's labor. She hadn't had time to change, rushing straight from the kitchen to the Grand Meridian. He probably thinks I'm staff. The thought stung, but she pushed it aside. Franklin would be waiting. Winchester's lips thinned, a barely perceptible tightening that spoke volumes. "Madam," he began, his voice smooth as polished silver, yet edged with a condescending coolness. "This establishment caters to a certain clientele." He gestured vaguely around the opulent lobby, at the plush velvet seating, the glittering chandeliers, the meticulously arranged floral displays. Each gesture felt like a deliberate, pointed jab at her appearance. Maryanne felt a flush creep up her neck. He's enjoying this. The realization settled in her stomach like a stone. This wasn't about dress codes. It was about power, about the petty satisfaction of wielding authority over someone deemed beneath him. "Not welcome here," he concluded, the words clipped final. The dismissal hung in the air, thick and suffocating. For a fleeting moment, Maryanne considered turning around, walking away. Pride warred with the desire to simply see Franklin. She closed her eyes briefly, inhaled a slow, steadying breath. "No, I won't let him win." Opening her eyes, she met Winchester's gaze directly. "My husband," she repeated, each word precise, "is Franklin Lawrence." The name hung in the air, a sudden shift in the atmosphere palpable. A nearby elderly woman, Mrs. Davis, a long-term employee of the hotel who often helped Maryanne with directions, paused in her dusting of a nearby marble statue, her eyes wide with apprehension. She glanced nervously between Maryanne and Winchester, a silent plea for reason in her gaze. Winchester, however, seemed oblivious to the subtle shift in the lobby's energy. He opened his mouth to speak, a dismissive retort already forming on his lips. Then, the heavy oak doors of the Grand Meridian swung open, and Franklin Lawrence stepped inside. The noise of the city seemed to fall silent, the bustling energy of the lobby momentarily stilled as all eyes turned towards him. He was a man accustomed to commanding attention, not through flamboyant displays, but through the sheer force of his presence. His gaze, sharp and intelligent, swept across the lobby, landing on Maryanne. A subtle, softening transformed his features. He strode towards her, his long strides eating up the distance. In that moment, Maryanne felt a wave of relief wash over her. The tension that had coiled tight within her began to unravel. Franklin reached her side, his hand finding hers, his touch warm and reassuring. He didn't need an explanation. He saw the subtle flush on her cheeks, the barely controlled anger in her eyes, and the rigid posture of the hotel manager hovering nearby. He understood. Before Maryanne could speak, Franklin turned to Winchester. "Is there a problem?" His voice was quiet, almost conversational, yet it carried an undeniable weight. Winchester's face, moments before so assured and condescending, now paled. The blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. His eyes darted between Maryanne and Franklin, a frantic, desperate plea flickering within them. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a strangled gasp escaped. The carefully constructed facade of professional composure crumbled. He recognized Franklin, of course. Who didn't? The social reformer, the philanthropist, the man whose influence extended to every corner of the city. The man whose wife he had just insulted and attempted to eject. Fool. Imbecile. Winchester berated himself internally. His career flashed before his eyes, a dizzying montage of hard work and ambition now teetering on the brink of ruin. He had been so focused on maintaining the hotel's image, on upholding the illusion of exclusivity, that he had failed to recognize the very person who could shatter it all with a single word. The silence stretched, taut, and unbearable. Mrs. Davis, her face etched with concern, discreetly retreated behind a large potted palm. The other occupants of the lobby, sensing the charged atmosphere, averted their gazes, pretending to be absorbed in their newspapers or conversations. Finally, Winchester stammered, "Mr. Lawrence, I didn't realize." Franklin's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer any platitudes or false reassurances. He simply waited, letting the silence amplify Winchester's discomfort. The message was clear. You underestimated my wife. You judged her based on appearances. You were wrong. Suddenly, the hurried footsteps of another man broke the tense silence. Marcus Bennett, the Grand Meridian's general manager, rushed into the lobby, his face a mask of controlled panic. He had been alerted to the situation by a frantic phone call from one of the bellhops. He took in the scene before him Franklin Lawrence, his wife, and the ashen-faced hotel manager, and instantly understood. Damage control. That was his priority now. "Mr. Lawrence," Bennett said smoothly, extending a hand. "A pleasure to see you. Is everything all right?" He directed a sharp, questioning glance at Winchester. "I believe," Franklin said, his voice still quiet but laced with steel, "Mr. Winchester was just explaining the hotel's dress code to my wife." Bennett's smile faltered. He shot Winchester a look of pure venom. "I assure you, Mr. Lawrence, there has been a misunderstanding. The Grand Meridian welcomes all guests." He turned to Winchester, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Perhaps you would like to escort Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence to their suite personally?" Winchester, his face still pale, nodded jerkily, his throat too constricted to speak. He gestured towards the elevators, his hand trembling slightly. As he led them away, the weight of his mistake pressed down on him, heavier than the opulent chandeliers that glittered above. The afternoon sun, once a symbol of the hotel's grandeur, now felt like a spotlight, illuminating his humiliation. He glanced back at Maryanne, her expression unreadable. In that moment, he understood. He hadn't just insulted a woman. He had insulted a principle. The principle of seeing beyond the surface, of recognizing the inherent worth in every individual, regardless of their attire. A principle that he, in his pursuit of superficial perfection, had utterly failed to grasp. The opulent lobby of the Grand Meridian hummed with the low murmur of hushed conversations and the clinking of fine china. Sunlight streamed through the arched windows, illuminating the intricate patterns of the Persian rug and the gleaming brass fixtures. Maryanne Lawrence, perched on the edge of a plush velvet armchair, felt the weight of gazes upon her. She knew she was an anomaly in this cathedral of elegance, her simple cotton dress and worn leather bag a stark contrast to the tailored suits and shimmering gowns that swirled around her. A faint scent of jasmine and sandalwood hung in the air, a stark contrast to the earthy smell of the community garden she'd left just an hour ago. "He thinks I don't belong here." The thought echoed the dismissive flick of Elliot Winchester's eyes, the subtle curl of his lip. It wasn't the first time she had encountered such thinly veiled disdain, but the sting of it never quite faded. Winchester cleared his throat, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor as he approached. He moved with a practiced air of authority, his perfectly coiffed hair and crisp suit exuding an aura of self-importance. Maryanne watched him, her hands clasped loosely in her lap, a quiet strength emanating from her stillness. "He's coming back. Why is he coming back?" A flicker of apprehension danced in her stomach, but her expression remained composed. She'd faced down tougher adversaries than a preening hotel manager. Perhaps I could help you find a more appropriate place to wait, madam. Winchester began, his voice smooth as silk, yet edged with a condescending tone that grated on Maryanne's nerves. He gestured vaguely towards the hotel's less opulent side entrance. The implication was clear. I'm well aware of what kind of hotel this is, Mr. Winchester, Maryanne replied, her voice calm yet firm. Her gaze held his, a flicker of steel in her otherwise gentle eyes. He assumes I'm lost, out of place. The thought sparked a quiet anger within her. She knew exactly where she was, exactly who she was waiting for. Her husband, Franklin Lawrence, was due any minute, and she refused to be shuffled away like some unwanted stray. Winchester's smile faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He hadn't anticipated such a direct response. He'd expected meekness, perhaps even embarrassment. He prided himself on his ability to read people, to categorize them with a single glance. This woman, however, defied his easy categorization. He adjusted his tie, the subtle movement betraying his growing unease. I understand, madam, but the Grand Meridian maintains certain standards. We strive to create an atmosphere of refined elegance for our guests. Standards. Elegance. The words echoed in Maryanne's mind, hollow and meaningless. What about standards of decency, of basic human respect? And those standards don't extend to everyone, I presume? She asked, her voice laced with a quiet irony that didn't escape Winchester's notice. A bead of sweat trickled down Winchester's temple. He glanced around the lobby, acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. This woman, with her quiet dignity and unwavering gaze, was proving to be more troublesome than he'd anticipated. He needed to resolve this quickly, discreetly. Madam, I assure you, it's simply a matter of decorum. Decorum? Maryanne's voice, though still soft, carried a new edge. Or is it something else, Mr. Winchester? Perhaps you're mistaking me for someone who doesn't belong here. Winchester opened his mouth to retort, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the weight of the lobby's attention, the silent judgment in the air. He was losing control of the situation, and the realization sent a wave of panic through him. Mrs. Davis, a long-term employee of the Grand Meridian, watched the exchange with a mixture of pity and apprehension. She had witnessed Winchester's condescending behavior countless times, but this time felt different. There was a quiet strength in the woman's demeanor that unsettled her. She knew Winchester, knew his obsession with appearances, his unwavering adherence to the hotel's rigid hierarchy. He's made a mistake. The thought echoed in her mind, a premonition of impending disaster. Just then, the grand entrance doors swung open, revealing a tall, imposing figure. Franklin Lawrence, his face etched with concern, strode into the lobby, his gaze immediately settling on his wife. The air in the lobby seemed to shift, charged with a sudden, palpable tension. Winchester's face paled, his eyes widening in recognition. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ashen. The carefully constructed facade of composure crumbled, replaced by a stark, naked fear. Marcus Bennett, the general manager, emerged from his office, drawn by the sudden hush that had fallen over the lobby. He took in the scene before him Winchester's stricken expression, the quiet fury in Maryanne's eyes, and the imposing presence of Franklin Lawrence. His mind raced, calculating the potential damage to the hotel's reputation. This is bad, very bad. He moved swiftly, his professional smile firmly in place, determined to contain the situation before it escalated further. The whispers in the lobby intensified, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. The air crackled with anticipation, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the silence. What would Franklin Lawrence do? The ornate clock above the Grand Meridian's reception desk chimed 3 times, the sound swallowed by the plush carpets and hushed conversations of the lobby. Maryanne Lawrence, her simple cotton dress a stark contrast to the gleaming marble and polished brass, shifted her weight. The slight ache in her lower back, a constant companion after a morning spent sorting donations at the city mission, pulsed with the rhythm of her growing impatience. Franklin was late. He knew she'd be tired. He knew she'd want to go straight home. A flicker of irritation, quickly suppressed, danced in her eyes. She shouldn't be surprised, though. His work, his passion, often consumed him, leaving little room for anything else, even her. Elliot Winchester, the hotel manager, a man whose perfectly tailored suit seemed molded to his frame, observed her from across the lobby. His lips thinned into a disapproving line. He'd seen her kind before the do-gooders, the charity cases, drifting in from the less savory parts of the city, leaving a trail of dust and discomfort in their wake. The Grand Meridian was a sanctuary of elegance, a haven for the elite. This woman, with her worn canvas bag and sensible shoes, was a stain on its pristine facade. His stomach churned with a mixture of distaste and the familiar, exhilarating thrill of power. He would rectify this. He always did. He crossed the lobby, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, each step a calculated assertion of his authority. "Ma'am," he began, his voice smooth, yet edged with steel, "the Grand Meridian has standards we must maintain." Internally, he savored the words, the subtle implication of her inadequacy hanging in the air between them. This was his domain, his stage, and he was the director, orchestrating the perfect image of refined exclusivity. Maryanne met his gaze, her own eyes widening slightly in surprise. Standards? Was he serious? "I'm merely waiting for my husband," she replied, her voice calm, even though a prickle of unease began to spread through her. The man's condescending tone, the way he looked down his nose at her, it was unsettlingly familiar. She'd encountered this kind of prejudice before, cloaked in polite disdain. It never ceased to amaze her how easily some people dismissed others based on appearances. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of the countless faces she'd seen that day, the genuine kindness and resilience she'd witnessed in the midst of hardship. This man, this puffed-up peacock, was nothing compared to them. "I understand, ma'am," Winchester persisted, his smile tight and insincere. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable waiting elsewhere. There are establishments more suited to your attire." The unspoken words, "you're kind," hung heavy in the air. A wave of heat rushed to Maryanne's cheeks. The casual dismissal, the thinly veiled insult, ignited a spark of anger within her. "I'm not leaving until my husband arrives." Her voice, though quiet, carried a new firmness. She straightened her spine, her grip tightening on the strap of her bag. She would not be intimidated. Not by this man, not by anyone. A small, wrinkled hand touched her arm. "Sir," a gentle voice interjected. Mrs. Davis, a long-term employee of the hotel, her face etched with years of observing the intricate dance of power and privilege within the Grand Meridian's walls, stepped forward. She'd seen this scenario play out before, the casual cruelty of assumptions, the quiet dignity of those unjustly judged. She couldn't stand idly by. "This lady is waiting for Mr. Lawrence. I'm sure he'll be here any minute." Winchester's eyes narrowed. Mrs. Davis, a relic of a bygone era, was a constant thorn in his side, her unwavering empathy a nuisance to his carefully constructed world of order and appearances. He opened his mouth to rebuke her, but the words caught in his throat. A figure had appeared in the doorway, a tall, imposing man with a presence that commanded attention. Franklin Lawrence. The blood drained from Winchester's face. He recognized the man instantly, not just from the countless newspaper articles and society pages, but from the deep-seated fear that the name Lawrence instilled in those who understood the true scope of his influence. This wasn't just a wealthy philanthropist. This was a force of nature, a man who could topple empires with a single well-placed word. His carefully constructed world, his meticulously maintained image, crumbled around him like a house of cards. Franklin strode across the lobby, his gaze fixed on Maryanne. He saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands, and a cold fury settled in his chest. He'd seen that look before, the quiet resignation that followed an encounter with the world's casual cruelty. He reached her side, his hand resting protectively on her arm. "Maryanne," he said, his voice soft, yet laced with an undercurrent of steel. "What's going on?" Before Maryanne could answer, Winchester stammered, "Mr. Lawrence, to apologize. I wasn't aware." His words trailed off, his mind racing, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation, to explain away his egregious error. Franklin's eyes, sharp and piercing, turned towards Winchester. The silence that followed was thick with tension, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The air seemed to crackle with unspoken power. "You weren't aware?" Franklin finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "You weren't aware that this is my wife?" Winchester swallowed hard, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of every scrutinizing eye in the lobby upon him, the whispers already beginning to circulate. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was drowning, suffocating under the weight of his own misjudgment. "I believe," Maryanne said, her voice calm and steady, though her eyes flashed with suppressed anger, "I'll walk myself out." She turned and walked towards the exit, her head held high, leaving Winchester standing there, a statue of stunned silence in the midst of the opulent lobby. Franklin followed her, his gaze lingering on Winchester for a moment longer, a silent promise of retribution hanging in the air. Marcus Bennett, the general manager, hurried forward, his face pale. Damage control. That was his primary function now. He had to contain this, to minimize the fallout. The Grand Meridian couldn't afford a scandal, not with someone like Franklin Lawrence. He began to speak, words of apology and explanation tumbling out, but Franklin simply raised a hand, silencing him. The unspoken message was clear: the damage was done, and someone would pay. The heavy oak doors of the Grand Meridian swung inward, propelled by a force that seemed to momentarily displace the hushed elegance of the lobby. A man strode in, his presence radiating a quiet power that drew every eye. Franklin Lawrence. Maryanne felt a subtle shift in the air, a tightening, a holding of breath, as if the very molecules of the room recognized the weight of the newcomer. Her own breath hitched, a mixture of relief and a strange, simmering anger. He hadn't called. He was supposed to be across town. Had someone alerted him? Or was this simply fate? She dismissed the thought as melodramatic, yet the coincidence tugged at her. Franklin paused, his gaze sweeping the lobby, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. His tailored suit, impeccably cut, contrasted sharply with the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams that slanted through the high windows. He looked like he belonged here, unlike her, in her simple cotton dress and worn cardigan, still carrying the faint scent of the soup kitchen. Shame, unexpected and hot, pricked at her. Then his eyes landed on her. Maryanne. His voice, though low, carried across the ornate space, cutting through the whispers and the clinking of china from the distant tea room. It wasn't a question, but a statement, a recognition. In that single word, the entire dynamic of the scene shifted. The security guard, who moments before had been inching closer, now stood frozen, his hand hovering uncertainly near his belt. Winchester, his face a mask of confused alarm, seemed to shrink back, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. Maryanne watched the blood drain from the manager's face, his eyes darting between her and Franklin, as if trying to reconcile the image of the woman he'd just dismissed with the arrival of this imposing figure. The realization dawned on him slowly, horribly, like a sunrise on a battlefield revealing the extent of the carnage. He had made a terrible, terrible mistake. Maryanne saw it in the minute twitch of his cheek, the slight tremble in his outstretched hand, the way his Adam's apple bobbed nervously. A small, bitter satisfaction bloomed in her chest. "Mr. Lawrence," Winchester stammered, his voice losing its previous crisp authority. He fumbled for words, his usual practice charm replaced by a desperate, almost pleading tone. Two had no idea. Franklin's gaze remained fixed on Maryanne, a silent question in his eyes. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, confirming his unspoken suspicion. He turned back to Winchester, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, amplifying the tension in the air. Mrs. Davis, bless her soul, stepped forward, her face etched with concern. "Mr. Lawrence, there seems to have been a misunderstanding," she began, her voice trembling slightly. Franklin raised a hand, silencing her. He took a step closer to Winchester, the subtle movement radiating an almost physical pressure. "You're making a mistake," Maryanne had said just moments ago. Now, she watched as her husband, with his quiet intensity, rectified that mistake. He didn't raise his voice, didn't resort to threats or bluster. His power lay in his stillness, in the weight of his gaze, in the unspoken knowledge of his influence. Winchester's internal monologue, Maryanne imagined, must have been a frantic scramble for damage control. He was a man accustomed to wielding power, to judging and dismissing, to upholding the superficial standards of his world. Now, he was confronted with a power far greater than his own, a power that didn't reside in starched collars and polished shoes, but in something deeper, more substantial. A figure hurried towards them, his face a mixture of anxiety and deference. Marcus Bennett, the general manager. He had no doubt been observing the scene unfold from his office, gauging the potential fallout. "Mr. Lawrence," he said, his voice smooth and conciliatory, "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. Please allow me to—" Franklin cut him short with a gesture. He finally spoke, his voice low and controlled, yet carrying a weight that resonated through the lobby. "My wife," he said, his gaze sweeping over the now hushed crowd, "was subjected to unacceptable treatment." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I trust this will be addressed appropriately." Bennett, sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning, stammered assurances, his eyes darting nervously towards Winchester, who stood frozen, his face ashen. The security guard, sensing the shift in power, had quietly retreated, melting back into the ornate woodwork. The small crowd of onlookers who moments before had been whispering amongst themselves now averted their gazes, pretending to study the intricate patterns of the Persian rug. Franklin turned to Maryanne, his expression softening. He offered her his arm, a silent apology, a silent acknowledgement of the indignity she had suffered. She took it, her hand trembling slightly. As they walked towards the elevators, leaving the wreckage of Winchester's carefully constructed world in their wake, Maryanne felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The fight had been small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, yet had drained her. She leaned against Franklin, drawing strength from his presence, from the quiet power that emanated from him. He hadn't needed to shout, to threaten, to make a scene. His mere presence had been enough. And in that quiet strength, Maryanne found a different kind of victory. The muted click of the suite door, closing behind Marcus Bennett, echoed the quiet thud of Maryanne's heart. She stood by the panoramic window overlooking the city, the twinkling lights a stark contrast to the turmoil that still simmered beneath her composure. The Grand Meridian's presidential suite, a haven of luxury, felt strangely suffocating. Franklin poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. He handed her one, the clinking glass a fragile sound in the expansive room. "Brandy." He knew her well. "Better?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that resonated with both concern and a barely restrained anger. Maryanne took a slow sip, the warmth spreading down her throat. Better? Was she better? The humiliation still stung, a raw patch beneath the forced calm she projected. "I suppose," she murmured, watching the shifting patterns of car lights below. "It's just bewildering that a man in his position could be so obtuse." Franklin's tone was laced with a dry irony that didn't quite mask the underlying tension. He took a longer swallow of his brandy, his gaze fixed on the swirling liquid in his glass. His usual gentle demeanor had been replaced by a quiet intensity, like a banked fire waiting to erupt. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't even truly expressed his anger, but Maryanne knew him. She knew the depth of his fury simmered beneath his controlled exterior. She knew the weight of his public persona, the careful balance he maintained. And she knew this incident, this petty slight, cut deeper than just a personal insult. It was an affront to everything he stood for, everything they both fought for. "It's more than that," she replied, finally turning from the window to meet his eyes. "It's the casual disregard, the ingrained prejudice." He looked at me, saw my clothes, and dismissed me as nothing. The sting returned, a prickle behind her eyes. She blinked it away, refusing to give Winchester the satisfaction of her tears. Franklin reached out, his hand warm and firm on hers. He saw what he wanted to see, he said, his voice softer now. A convenient narrative that allowed him to exercise his petty authority. He squeezed her hand gently. "He underestimated you, Maryanne. He underestimated us both." A knock interrupted the fragile peace. Marcus Bennett, the general manager, stood at the door, his face pale and etched with a nervous tension that spoke volumes. He apologized profusely, his words tumbling over each other in a rush of corporate contrition. Winchester, he reported, had been suspended pending a full investigation. He assured them that such behavior was not tolerated at the Grand Meridian, that it was an isolated incident, a rogue employee, the usual platitudes. Maryanne listened patiently, observing the subtle tremor in Bennett's hand as he dabbed his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He was terrified, not of her, but of Franklin, of the potential fallout, the damage to the hotel's reputation, the wrath of a man who could sway public opinion with a single word. She understood his fear, but it didn't lessen the underlying unease she felt. Punishment wouldn't solve the problem. It wouldn't address the root cause. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice calm and even, cutting through his nervous rambling. "I appreciate your swift action, but perhaps dismissal isn't the answer." Bennett blinked, clearly taken aback. Franklin, too, turned to her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You're too forgiving, Maryanne," he said, his voice low. She shook her head. "It's not about forgiveness, Franklin. It's about making a difference." She looked at Bennett, her gaze steady and direct. "Mr. Winchester clearly needs education. Perhaps, instead of dismissing him, he could undergo sensitivity training, volunteer at the community center where I work, see firsthand the people he so casually dismissed." Bennett's eyes widened, the fears slowly giving way to a cautious hope. He stammered something about considering the proposal, about discussing it with the board, about implementing new training programs. The words were empty, corporate jargon, but Maryanne saw a flicker of genuine understanding in his eyes. A seed had been planted. Franklin remained silent, his gaze fixed on Maryanne. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Was this her way of truly addressing the injustice? Or was it a misplaced sense of empathy for a man who had so casually demeaned her? Later, as the city lights shimmered through the vast windows of the suite, Maryanne sat curled on the plush sofa, a book open but unread in her lap. Franklin sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his presence a comforting weight. He hadn't spoken much since Bennett's departure, his silence a canvas onto which Maryanne projected her own swirling thoughts. Doubts niggled at her. Was she naive to think she could change a man like Winchester? Was she foolish to offer compassion where perhaps only condemnation was deserved? "You surprised me tonight," Franklin finally said, his voice quiet, thoughtful. Maryanne looked up at him, her heart tightening. "Surprised you how?" He turned to her, his gaze searching. "By your restraint, by your focus on a solution, not retribution." He paused, his thumb gently stroking her arm. It was inspiring. The word hung in the air, a fragile echo in the quiet room. Inspiring. Maryanne felt a wave of emotion wash over her. Not relief, not vindication, but a quiet satisfaction. Perhaps, she thought, this small act, this unconventional response, could be a catalyst for something more. A ripple of change in a vast ocean of prejudice and inequality. Perhaps that was all any of them could hope for. A single ripple, expanding outward, touching more lives than they could ever know. The fight for equality, she realized, wasn't always fought on grand stages. Sometimes it was fought in the quiet moments, in the choices they made, in the compassion they offered, even to those who least deserved it. And in those moments, the smallest ripples could create the biggest waves. The clatter of mismatched cutlery, the rhythmic thud of a cleaver against a worn wooden board, and the low hum of the industrial refrigerator formed a strangely comforting symphony. A week had passed since the incident at the Grand Meridian, a week that had felt like an eternity for Elliot Winchester. The opulent lobby, the hushed whispers of wealthy patrons, the crisp scent of expensive perfume all felt like a distant, unsettling dream. Now, the air hung thick with the aroma of simmering stew and the faint tang of bleach. He inhaled deeply, the unfamiliar scent a stark reminder of his fall from grace. Elliot tightened his grip on the potato peeler, his knuckles white against the worn metal. The simple act of peeling potatoes felt foreign, clumsy. His hands, accustomed to signing checks and shaking hands with dignitaries, now fumbled with the rough skin of the vegetable. He glanced sideways at Maryanne Lawrence, her movements swift and practiced as she diced carrots. She hadn't spoken to him directly since his arrival at the community center that morning, a silence that felt heavier than any reprimand. He imagined her hands, those same hands that now effortlessly wielded a kitchen knife, had once graced the arms of powerful men, danced in glittering ballrooms. The thought was a sharp, uncomfortable prick to his pride. The kitchen could use better organization, though, he mumbled, the words escaping before he could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. He cursed his impulsive tongue, the ingrained habit of finding fault, of seeking control. He braced himself for her icy retort, for the righteous anger he deserved. Instead, Maryanne paused, the knife hovering over the cutting board. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, something that wasn't anger, but pity. He swallowed, the lump in his throat growing larger. "And this isn't charity, Elliot," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You're earning your second chance." Her gaze shifted back to the carrots, her hands resuming their rhythmic dance. Elliot felt a strange mix of shame and relief wash over him. He wasn't being dismissed. He wasn't being ridiculed. He was being given an opportunity to prove he was more than the polished veneer of the hotel manager, more than the man who judged a book by its cover. He picked up another potato, his movements a little less hesitant, a little more purposeful. The rhythmic scraping of the peeler against the potato skin became a meditative rhythm, a small act of atonement. He thought about the faces of the people he had turned away from the Grand Meridian, the dismissive wave of his hand, the condescending tone of his voice. He had built his career on appearances, on maintaining a facade of exclusivity, and in doing so, he had lost sight of something fundamental, the inherent worth of every individual. The kitchen buzzed with activity. Volunteers bustled around him, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Mrs. Davis, the kind-faced woman from the hotel, gave him a warm smile as she passed by, carrying a tray of freshly baked bread. The aroma filled the air, a comforting scent that had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with simple nourishment. He watched Maryanne as she moved through the kitchen, her presence a quiet force that held the chaos together. There was a grace in her movements, a genuine warmth in her interactions with the volunteers and the people who came to the center for meals. It was a different kind of elegance, one that had nothing to do with expensive clothes or polished manners. It was the elegance of a soul dedicated to serving others. He realized, with a startling clarity, that the real poverty wasn't in worn clothes or empty pockets, but in a closed heart. He had been so blinded by his own prejudice, so consumed by the superficial, that he had failed to see the true wealth that existed within these walls. The wealth of compassion, of resilience, of community. As he worked, he began to notice the small details he had overlooked before. The chipped mugs, each with its own unique history. The worn patches on the aprons, testaments to countless hours of service. The laughter lines etched around Mrs. Davis's eyes, a map of a life well lived. He saw the faces of the people who came to the center, not as charity cases, but as individuals with their own stories, their own struggles, their own triumphs. He started to understand the quiet dignity in their acceptance of help, the unspoken gratitude in their eyes. "Here," Maryanne said, placing a bowl of peeled and diced vegetables in front of him. "The stew needs onions." Her voice was still devoid of warmth, but there was a hint of something else, something that resembled acceptance. He met her gaze, a silent apology in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He picked up a knife and began to chop the onions, the pungent aroma stinging his eyes. He blinked back the tears, not tears of sadness or self-pity, but tears of strange, unfamiliar emotion. He thought it might be hope. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Meridian Ballroom cast a kaleidoscopic shimmer over the opulent scene. A month had passed since the incident, yet the memory remained etched in Elliot Winchester's mind, a constant prickle beneath the veneer of his professional composure. Tonight, the ballroom throbbed with the city's elite, gathered for the annual charity fundraiser, the very event that had brought Maryanne Lawrence to the hotel that fateful afternoon. Elliot smoothed down his perfectly tailored tuxedo, the fabric a stark contrast to the coarse linen of the apron Mrs. Davis had worn that day. He could still see the gentle resignation in her eyes as she had tried to intervene, a silent reproach to his own callous behavior. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, the gatekeeper of this bastion of privilege, had been utterly blind to true worth. The air hummed with a murmur of polite conversation, punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes. Elliot moved through the crowd with an almost mechanical precision, his smile practiced, his greetings impeccably delivered. Yet, beneath the surface, a current of unease thrummed. Every glance, every whispered word, felt like a judgment. He was a man walking a tightrope, the memory of his transgression a constant threat to his precarious balance. He caught sight of Mrs. Davis across the room, her face etched with a mixture of weariness and quiet amusement. Their eyes met, and a faint, almost imperceptible nod passed between them. It was a small gesture, yet it held a weight of understanding that made Elliot's breath catch in his throat. He knew she hadn't forgotten. How could she? He hadn't forgotten the shame that had flooded him when Franklin Lawrence, a man whose name resonated with power and respect, had arrived and quietly, devastatingly, revealed his wife's identity. Tonight, Franklin Lawrence stood on the raised platform, his presence commanding the attention of the room. Elliot watched from the sidelines, a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation knotting his stomach. The past month had been a slow, agonizing climb back towards some semblance of self-respect. He'd spent hours replaying the scene in his mind, dissecting his own motivations, confronting the ingrained prejudices that had led him to treat Maryanne with such disdain. He'd made amends, in his own way, increasing Mrs. Davis's salary, implementing sensitivity training for the staff, small gestures that felt inadequate against the magnitude of his offense. Franklin's voice, resonant and clear, cut through the gentle chatter. "We gather here tonight," he began, his gaze sweeping across the room, "to celebrate the spirit of giving, to reaffirm our commitment to those less fortunate." Elliot swallowed hard, the words echoing the hollow pronouncements he himself had made countless times, words that had held no real meaning until now. He'd always viewed these events as a performance, a necessary ritual to maintain the hotel's prestigious image. Now, listening to Franklin, he felt a pang of something akin to shame. What did he truly know of giving? Of genuine compassion? His charity had been transactional, a calculated investment in reputation, not a reflection of true empathy. But true generosity, Franklin continued, his voice taking on a new intensity, extends beyond the writing of a check. It demands a fundamental shift in perspective. It requires us to see the inherent worth in every individual, regardless of their circumstances, their appearance, their perceived social standing. Elliot felt the blood drain from his face. The words were a pointed reminder, a public indictment of his own failings. He could feel the weight of the room's attention, imagined whispers and judging stares. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the ornate wallpaper, to become invisible. The true measure of our society, Franklin's voice resonated with conviction, isn't how we treat those we admire or fear, but how we treat those we think can do nothing for us. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elliot's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Franklin was speaking directly to him, to the man he had been a month ago. He glanced across the room and saw Maryanne, standing beside her husband, a serene smile gracing her lips. There was no trace of resentment in her eyes, only a quiet dignity that made Elliot feel even smaller. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Elliot threw himself into his work, orchestrating the event with a feverish intensity. He made sure every guest felt valued, every request was fulfilled, every detail attended to with meticulous care. He spoke to Mrs. Davis, not with the condescending politeness he had once reserved for her, but with genuine respect. He listened to her concerns about the staff's working conditions, promised to address them. He even found himself engaging in conversations with some of the volunteers, people he would have previously dismissed as insignificant. He found, to his surprise, that they had stories to tell, insights to offer, a humanity that he had been blind to before. As the evening drew to a close, Elliot found himself standing near the exit, watching the guests depart. Franklin and Maryanne approached him, and Elliot braced himself for the final judgment. "Mr. Winchester," Franklin said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I wanted to thank you for your contribution to tonight's event. It was a resounding success." Elliot stammered a reply, his throat tight with emotion. "It was me pleasure, Mr. Lawrence." Maryanne simply smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Elliot," she said, using his first name for the first time. The simple act of acknowledging him, of treating him with the same respect she offered everyone else, was more potent than any reprimand could have been. They turned to leave, and Elliot watched them go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. He knew he would never forget the humiliation of that afternoon, but he also knew that he had learned a valuable lesson. The true measure of a man wasn't the power he wielded or the position he held, but the way he treated those who seemed to have nothing to offer in return. And in that, Elliot Winchester finally understood he had a long way to go. The ballroom emptied, the music faded, and the glittering lights dimmed. Elliot stood alone in the silence, the weight of the past lifting, replaced by the fragile hope of redemption.